Us for another week of our Bible study series during the month of February. This is week 3 of our Soul Care and African American um, practice Bible study. You're going to hear some beeps and sound like a truck backing up. Our neighborhood pretty much has been a construction zone for a couple of years now. We're wrapping up the work here at the church. But I think Project Homes is building a couple of homes across the street from us. So you may hear the effects of their working outside while we're recording this Bible study. Before we get started, help us share the word if you don't mind by pushing out our social media links. If you're on Facebook, you can start a watch party or share the video. If you're on Twitter, same thing. Just go to our church Twitter page and retweet that. You can quote tweet it or retweet it, whatever. Will draw people's attention. Take a picture of the page and post it on Instagram. Or if you're just watching it on YouTube, send a text or email and let folks know that they should join in today. After the video, this is our third week doing this. After the video, and we've had really good turnout the first 2 weeks. Join us via video. Download the Dialpad Meeting app. Download the Dialpad Meeting app so that you can use the video element to it. All right, download that, or you can go to in the browser of your computer. Meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC. Or if you just want to do audio, you can call 804-203-9011. I know Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the most well-known figure discussed during February, especially since we've been focusing in and honing in on Black history as a nation. But today, I don't want to go through and talk about the timeline for civil rights or human rights. I'm not trying to take you back to Montgomery bus boycott or Birmingham or Selma or Albany, and tell you the stories that you already know about Martin Luther King Jr. We're not going that route today. Today we want to focus on a different aspect of Dr. King's life. And we all know Dr. King was a spiritual and a political leader. And I'll go back and I'll talk about that in a second. Noted for his participation in civil rights. But we want to talk about how, in order for him to pursue and fulfill his God-given assignments, it was imperative, it was necessary that Dr. King had to hear from God. There had to be a relationship with God. There had to be some hearing. There had to be some talking. There had to be some discussing with God. And in order for him to receive the prophetic directives needed for a movement of justice, a movement of liberty, prayer was a necessary discipline. And one of the things that we don't talk about as much when we talk about Martin Luther King Jr., we focus on him being an advocate or, as I defined him earlier, a political leader. Somebody fighting for social justice. And yes, he did all of those things, but Martin Luther King was a preacher first, and he was working in that stead. The Montgomery bus boycott, he became the leader because of an NAACP meeting where folk came together and then they wanted to start a new group. And because Dr. King was fairly new in town, educated, and a preacher, they elevated him to leadership. He was always a preacher first. Right? It was always about his Christian beliefs first. And so today we're going to talk about that part of who he was, his relationship with God, and how his relationship with God moved him while doing the work of equality, of liberty, and of justice in the United States of America. The nonviolent protests that Dr. King helped lead transformed America. God used him in the movement, and those who are involved in the movement. I always struggle when we talk about civil rights because Dr. King becomes the face of it, but clearly there were many others from all across the United States, men, women, black, white, who played huge parts. Persons who lost their lives for us to have some of the rights that we have today. Um, and so I always feel a certain level of guilt when I talk about King, um, because in essence I'm doing what we all do, which is make one person a leader, when there are a lot of people who made up this movement. All right, but God used King and the movement to change the face of racial interactions in America. Dr. King's godly assignment was to be a conduit bringing equality to all people. And to better prepare himself for the journey, God called him to study the seminary, Crozier Theological Seminary, in Pennsylvania. Dr. King was on a fast track, and he graduated high school at 15. 15 for many of us is the 10th grade. So he skipped a couple of years, and then went on to Morehouse and got his undergrad. He was 19, and he went to Crozier Theological Seminary as a 19-year-old. Is at Crozier and Boston University as he works on his master's, works on his master's degree, works on his PhD, that he began learning more about the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi, who was instrumental during the Declaration of Independence in India, worthy of a study in his own right. As a student of Gandhi, King found what he'd been seeking, a method of achieving social reform through nonviolent philosophy. Now, Dr. King's philosophy was a synthesis of teachings of Jesus Christ, and of Gandhi. Jesus' love and sermons on love in the New Testament, and Gandhi's teaching of nonviolence provided him with philosophical and theological insights that can be described as a philosophical theology. Dr. King's ministry then incorporates philosophy and theology to accomplish his spiritual assignment for the kingdom and the people for whom God calls him to serve. Now, I wrestle with this because, again, I tell you, King's ministry was preacher first. It was guided by Christian principles. It was the ideology and the theology that was constructed as he was a student at Morehouse and focused more on black empowerment and who we were as black people. And then he went to Crozier in Boston University and wrestling with the teachings of Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr and their whole thoughts about the social construct that we are part of. And then you add on the very real and dynamic leadership in India of Mahatma Gandhi. And you have a theology and an ideology that guides a young preacher in his mid-20s who's called to be being thrust upon the national stage. And it is amazing that what we can be taught can guide our journey. And so I pray that you guys don't think that your learning is not worth it, that what is being deposited into you is not worth it. I know for myself, a lot of what I pull now comes from stuff that I learned in seminary or things in my reading. That's the reason I still try to read every day, to shape my mind, so that when I'm put in the opportunities, what is in me can come out and play itself out in real life. Claiborne Carson, who is, and Coretta Scott King pretty much entrusted Dr. Martin Luther King's papers after 1985, well beyond his death in the late 60s. Coretta Scott King allowed Dr. Carson to be the person that ran the MLK Papers project. He started one of the first Martin Luther King Institutes across the country at Stanford University. Claiborne Carson wrote one of the main tenets of Gandhi and then King's philosophy was the conviction that nonviolent resistance was one of the most potent weapons available to oppressed people in their quest for social justice. Dr. King's philosophical and theological methodology was instrumental in the emancipation of people, period. Physical, emotional, and spiritual. And his work, the labor of it, has been instrumental in shaping the unique theological and contextual definition of prayer and of spiritual direction for persons of African descent. The author, Dr. Peacock, labels Dr. Martin Luther King as a contemplative. The definition of a contemplative is a person whose life is devoted primarily to prayer, especially in a monastery or a convent. Peacock calls King a contemplative, and she further supports and builds upon it by quoting Dr. Ruth Haley Barton. Dr. Ruth Haley Barton wrote, quote, "Contemplation and prayerfulness were at the core of King's being and led to his profound commitment to decisive and living action in the world. Contemplative action is what emerges from our real encounters with God." And so Peacock is saying that what comes out of the movement led in essence, based upon what we've said, by Dr. King, but multiple groups. SELC, shout out to them. SNCC, shout out to them. CORE, shout out to them. And there are many, many, many others who are doing the work. But we have identified King as the leader. And her argument is the action emerges from encounters with God. It is doing what God calls us to do when God calls us to do it, no matter how free we are, how ill-equipped we feel. Contemplative action is the willingness to go beyond being primarily concerned for our own safety and our own survival to the place where we know that our real life is hidden with Christ in God, no matter what happens to our physical life. All right? Contemplative action is doing the right thing at the right time in the right spirit, completely given over to a power that is beyond our own, even and perhaps more especially when the risks are very great. This kind of action is impossible without being radically in touch with the source of our life through prayer and contemplation. Dr. King's life from 57 or 58, the last decade of his life was a life lived daily at the risk of dying. His first serious turn toward death was by a woman who had some mental health issues, black woman, who stabbed him in the chest with a letter opener, pretty much killed him, or almost killed him. So he was living his life in danger. And so Dr. Peacock, by calling him contemplative, is in essence saying that it was daily prayer and connection with God on a spiritual level that kept King alive. And because King was alive, he was able to be motivated to do the work and then spread out to be a blessing to mankind. With the mandate from God to be an intercessor, a spiritual leader, a fighter for marginalized people, Dr. King had an enormous task. Only God could give him the necessary spiritual directives to lead, to minister, and oppress people. It originally started in Alabama, but became a fighter for people all across the country. And I'm sure that King experienced times of uncertainty. I'm almost absolute that he faced it probably daily. I know he did, based upon the stuff that I read. Uncertainty was a part of his life, but also his assurances from God, which came through prayer, empowered him to move forward. Martin Luther King's life, a life of contemplative prayer, made him an effective spiritual leader. He was an effective spiritual leader. Dr. Barton wrote, and we already quoted her earlier, quote, "Were it not for his full engagement in the fight for justice and his groundedness in the life of prayer, he might never have had the kind of encounter with God that transformed him in the deepest level of his being," unquote. The author goes on to say, because of his faithful obedience, the trajectory of our nation and the world looks a little different than it would have without his contributions. Now, it would have been impossible for Dr. King to fulfill the mandate on his life without the assurance of God's unconditional love for himself and all humanity. And again, I will interject that it was also the relationships that Dr. King had with persons of faith. When his spirit was down in the middle of the night or on a trip or while he was going through something, it was, those relationships where he could call him Mahalia Jackson and let her sing to him, minister to him in essence when his spirit got low. Or the other preachers and persons who were connected to these churches all across the country, because the movement found its core and its essence in the church. The Greek term for the kind of love that Dr. King practiced, that love, that agape love, quote, aims to preserve and create community. As a leader, Dr. King was called by God to lead a movement for freedom that was centered in that Christ-centered love. With such love, King loved God, and King loved God's people to the extent, listen, that he was willing to die for what he believed. His wife, Coretta Scott King, once said, "For my husband, Martin Luther King Jr., prayer was a daily source of courage and strength that gave him the ability to carry on even in the darkest hours of our struggle." With his head in his hands, Martin bowed over the kitchen table and prayed aloud to God. "Lord, I am taking a stand for what I believe is right. The people are looking to me for leadership. And if I stand before them without strength and courage, they will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I cannot face it alone," unquote. The movement toward freedom had brought Martin Luther King Jr. to his knees. Yes, his wife, I just read a quote, had heard his humble cry and it remained etched on his mind and in his heart. And those who follow King, there are a couple of prayers where King talks about in his sermons or in his speeches, where he would get a phone call, he'd answer it, somebody say some mean stuff, threaten his life, and he is by himself in the middle of the night, and it's his relationship with God that sustains him. At Dr. King's lowest points, Coretta heard her spiritual companion turn to the ultimate spiritual director, the Holy Spirit. She listened attentively to her husband during those trying times. And such listening is one of the characteristics of spiritual direction and soul care. Ms. King went on to say that he later told her, quote, "At that moment, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced it before. It seemed as though I could hear a voice saying, 'Stand up for righteousness, stand up for truth, and God will be at our side forever.'" And that, some of King's greatest sermons, he ends with this run. When he stood up from the table, he had a new sense of confidence and was better prepared and equipped to face the enormous challenges ahead of him. He had a supernatural encounter with the divine director and was empowered to fulfill his God-given, world-changing assignment. Dr. King's sermon or speech of his coffee table prayer, because he's actually talked about it several times, which That's why you need to get on afterwards, because we're going to listen to that in our after Bible study chat. Was a critical turning point for the struggle, not just of the Montgomery boycott, not just of that period of time, but it was a turning point for the struggle for African American freedom, period. Because from that point forward, we had a leader who was divinely inspired and would not be turned back by the multiple threats of numerous forms of violence. This kind of courage, this kind of conviction is truly contagious, and Dr. King's powerful leadership inspires us to continue to carry the justice torch through the difficult days of our journey. As a result of his encounter with God, Dr. King's deepest desire was that the people of God would strive to encourage God's best for themselves and God's purpose for their life. And listen, deep within his heart, King knew that fulfilling the will of God was his ultimate assignment. Why? Because he was a preacher first. As a spiritual leader, he desired more of God for himself as well as for those that he led. He desired to see the complete manifestation of the activity of God in the lives of those that he called to serve. Prayer is a spiritual discipline, and we talked about this at the beginning. Dr. Peacock talked about the disciplines for soul care in the African American community and culture. Prayer is a spiritual discipline that causes our ears to be attentive to the voice of our almighty, all-knowing, all-powerful God, as God gives wisdom and as God gives direction. Prayer is the discipline that fueled the movement for civil and human rights. Through the practice of prayer, God imparted revelation, God imparted knowledge into the mouth of and the mind and mouth of Dr. King, which empowered him to move forward by faith. Because Martin Luther King Jr. realized that his kingdom assignment was beyond himself, he prayerfully sought, listen, God for direction. And I would imagine, given the intensity of his assignment, that his prayer life was intense with pleas to God for favor, for direction, for wisdom. Some prayers empowered him to accomplish his task. Even though his prayers cannot be seen with the natural eye in our nation and in our world, we see the benefits of his tenacity. How much more do we still need to see such prayers and such leadership today? In soul care in African American practice, Dr. Peacock being an author, quotes, for 12 years, King had served as a Moses to Black Americans. He had led them part of the long and distant way up the mountain of freedom and equality. They would have to complete the ascent without him. They would have to complete the journey totally depending on God and where God was moving. King had completed his job. He had allowed God to use him as an instrument to direct and lead. Dr. King called Black America to continue on without him. Dr. King had the ability to perceive that there is something noble in humanity that once tapped has the power to transform the world, unquote. Dr. King's prayer time with God proved the wisdom he needed to minister, lead, and model spiritual directives and soul care for the people of God, past, present, and future. In Dr. King's last speech, he says, we've got to give ourselves to this struggle until the end. Either we go up together or we go down together. And that's from his last speech on April the 3rd, 1968. As we wrap it up, other than God, no one understood the complex challenges that Dr. King endured better than those close to him. Many of his associates and friends who traveled with him all around the country, possibly the closest, his wife Coretta. She was with him during the sleepless nights when he was in town and he was under threat. She was the one that saw him fall humbly to his knees as he saw God. She was the one who saw him shed tears and express fears. This woman of God was by his side during the civil rights movement, which affected thousands of people around the nation and the world. When speaking of their prayerful journey, Ms. King said, quote, Prayer was a wellspring of strength and inspiration during the civil rights movement. Throughout the movement, we prayed for greater human understanding. We prayed for the safety of our compatriots in the freedom struggle. We prayed for victory in our nonviolent protests, for brotherhood and sisterhood among people of all races, for reconciliation and fulfillment of the beloved community, unquote. Prayer was a lifeline for the King family. Regardless of the difficulties encountered on their complex journeys, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. took the time to hear from God. King came from a praying family. His father was a preacher, pastor. Grandfather, preacher, pastor. He brought up in the culture of being close to God. And King never got too busy to fulfill the monumental mandates of his life. As a contemplative pastor, he took the time to perform the work affiliated with his divine calling. Dr. King was purposeful in developing his relationship with God, developing his relationship with others, and these type of relationships. And that tending of it is a focus in spiritual direction and caring for the soul. His cultivation of his heart and his mind empowered him. Having solace in God equipped him to more effectively confront the issues before him and the people he served. The Lord's guidance was evident in King's life, and he exemplified the attributes of a passionate spiritual leader. We told you that this series will be shorter, this Bible study video anyway, because we want to have more discussion during our after Bible study chat. Today, I want you to come over to Dialpad so you can share with me what you have taken from our discussion today as it relates to the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And as I told you, we're going to play a clip. Our question for today: what can you glean from the prayer life of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Thank you, my brothers and my sisters. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I pray you're going to jump over to our After Bible Study chat. I hope that you've downloaded the Dialpad app. If you have not, probably too late to do it to be a part of our video chat today, but you can find other ways to get on. Meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC. Meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC. Or call 804-203-9011. All right. I would love for you to participate. We'd love to see you, but definitely want you to be a participant. Remember, prayer call in the morning, feeding on Friday at 12:45, virtual worship on Sunday, and we celebrate Founders Day on Sunday. 2 weeks from Founders Day, we're going to be back in the sanctuary. March 6th. March 6th is our return date for 1045 worship. All right, March 6th. In the meantime, get off Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Sign off now. Go over to Dialpad. Those of you on Dialpad, hang on. Let's continue this conversation.